Yep, it's in the title. Soulslike is not a genre. It's not even a subgenre, so get it out of your head, okay? However, it's being treated as such, which is confusing people, and the one thing I don't like is being confused. Of course, I'm not the only gamer who knows that this term is not a genre, okay? Even developers are aware of this term, which is why they can either choose to use it for marketing purposes or they can disregard it entirely, because an artist does deserve to have some pride in their work and creative ideas. These things take time, a lot of money and energy, okay? Soulslike is a fan term. Actually, it's more of a comparison term created to compare and scrutinize games from other developers to From Software's Souls trilogy, which From Software themselves didn't even adhere to that as well with creating Sekiro and even Bloodborne. Just to give an example of a fan term, Lovecraftian. Lovecraftian is not a subgenre. It's not even a genre. The actual genre that was somewhat inspired by Lovecraft's work is called cosmic horror, okay? There's no such thing as a Lovecraftian subgenre, so get that out of your head as well. But it is how we can compare other works to his if you want to go that route. And that can blur the lines quite a bit, because even Lovecraft was inspired by a large group of already established writers, and some were actually his mentors who helped him into the industry. But some of the other writers who inspired Lovecraft's work were Edgar Allan Poe and the author who created The Yellow King, or the actual title of that book was The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. I know I'm skimping on my words here. A lot of writers of these works were already nihilistic in nature, cynical, even terrifying, because they wrote about the shadow side of humanity that is repressed. And what inspired these writers were the unknown and the complexity of the human psyche, something that was already being heavily delved into in psychology. But back to the term Soulslike, most characteristics that fans mention are not exclusive to From Software. Dark Soul genre category was action RPG, and not only that, it was made for adults in mind, not kids, all the while adapting elements that we would have only been seen in films or just in written works. They are now games. The setting and story of the Souls trilogy fell under the subgenre of dark fantasy, which is under fantasy. Everything is an umbrella term. Horror has several subgenres under it, me mentioning before cosmic horror being one of them. So when developers are making games, the writers, the game designers, they have only one thing in mind, the actual genre they are going for. People cannot grasp that how artists and writers get inspired in the first place is by several works that are already done before them. From Software did the same like any developer before it. It is inspired by various styles of storytelling, just like any other developer would have done the same. Environmental storytelling is a part of various genres of game before From Software even existed, because as I was saying to my teammates, the gaming industry was pursuing to be seen as an art form. Ever since Pac-Man, it was pursuing to become a new art form. So there were already so many inspirations to cherry pick from the time From Software wanted to enter the picture. The whole idea of reading items to get the lore or a broader understanding of the world and what's going on was taken from sleuth games, okay? The comparison I would make is the original Alone in the Dark and Silent Hill, since I've played those games. The fighting mechanics From Software used already existed, but it was used in children's games. Kingdom Hearts is a good example of gathering skill points to unlock abilities such as Pari that puts enemies into a stun, to dodge, different fighting arts through unlocking abilities, and different keyblade options that do different fighting arts. And with the bosses, Kingdom Hearts is a good example of having secret optional bosses that are unlocked in different areas of the game for those who go and seek it, okay? And some of those bosses kind of required getting good. And because back then they created difficult settings, playing on the hardest mode made it challenging. Kingdom Hearts also had respawning of enemies and the concept of farming in that game for currency, items, and skill points. And this game franchise was way before From Software. Difficulty is not a good characteristic used to describe games because there were plenty of games long before From Software that were so difficult you kind of threw fits. From Software just removed the difficulty setting, but they replaced it with resources along with leveling and the concept of creating builds, which are all still under the RPG elements of what makes an RPG game. From Software is not a genre of its own because of it. Souls cannot be considered a subgenre because of fans wanting it to be. Now, because back then there were no save points in certain games, and if you died, you would get thrown back to the title screen and start all over again. I don't think any of you guys remember those games. Those were the first and true controller breaking games. Now, regarding no hand holding. Back in the day of Nintendo and the Sega Genesis era, there was no hand holding in games. Literally, you had to buy a magazine or a book of the game you are playing to figure out areas and certain combination of buttons to press on certain enemies. There was even a call hotline where an experienced person would instruct how to beat a certain section of the game. I was just reminded of this recently, and I remembered my gaming buddies back in the day calling that number. We were just tweens then. We would call that hotline even for Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat to learn the controller combinations to activate certain movesets. This was the notebook era, people, of writing things down. This was how cheat codes came into play over the years as well. From Software, like any developer, made artistic choices to how they would use a variety of mechanics and story inspirations. I kind of describe From Software's fighting mechanics as bare bones because they stripped away a lot of the flashiness from other games, made it clunky like a snail, but instead of throwing you back to the title screen, they granted mercy and just stripped away your currency. I know, I'm rhyming. That's actually what From Software played well on, stealing your currency with every death. That was their way of punishing the players, which can be taken as difficult because that currency is used to level up your character and to buy the resources you need to win the fights. Because there are still games that are way more difficult than From Software games, but they are under different genres and they don't have a lick of the same mechanics, but it's still challenging depending on the player. But people who enjoy From Software like their style of gameplay. Fortunately for me, I'm well-rounded in different genre of games and gameplay out there. Some I like more than others, but I see it for what it is. I don't like to compare games, and I just go by what the developers created. I treat it like a piece of artwork being viewed. The only difference is the gameplay, which adds to the complexity of it. I view the art style the the style of art they use. I consider the story being told. I take notice of their artistic decisions on how they display their characters and their world, the sound effects, the music, and then the gameplay. And it has to fit to create that world. It means it has to be cohesive to be immersive. Some forms of gameplay will not be thrilling for others because it requires the player to play a certain way. It doesn't mean it's not a good game. It just means the gameplay is not for you. We have to learn to respect that games are not made to cater to just one form of play style. I even have to respect that. I just don't get anything good out of the gameplay in certain games. However, some games, story and art style just didn't help the situation either because I have my own standards and personal preferences. I've realized a lot of boxes have to be ticked for me to enjoy a game, but that doesn't mean it needs to be a fun game. Not all games are made to be fun anymore, and that's because art or even written works and films are not all for sheer entertainment. A lot are created to be thought-provoking and to transform the mind. Almost every game for the past 30-some years has had an underlying moral to its story or propaganda or something that is not seen right away because as a kid playing these games, you don't have the knowledge or the experience to catch it yet. The stories and setting of these games didn't conjure out of nowhere. They were inspired by other stories, belief systems, philosophy, and so on. So, Soulslike can never become a subgenre because it's associated with only one developer and what they did with what inspired them for that particular trilogy of game. It's not a compliment to compare games to certain developers and their style of games, especially when that gaming developer is saying they don't want to be compared or even associated with that term because they have a genre they are creating for a particular audience, not just one subcategory of communities here. I'm an artist as well, except my medium is different. But I can say this with confidence because I view several art styles of work from various artists because that's a part of the learning experience is to have exposure. It's not a compliment if my work or myself gets compared to another artist and their work when I do create something of my own because my intent along with my own artistic expression is going into my work, and the meaning behind my work will not be the same whatsoever. Comparing invalidates my work, my emotions, my creativity, and my imagination. Games are now an art medium, okay? Each game, it's its own piece of artwork. Gamers just haven't caught up to that notion yet. Fans aren't necessarily doing developers any favors by creating fan-based terms. In all mediums, there's a downside to fan-based terms. It actually oppresses other developers because a person who labels one of their releasing games as a Souls-like, it's going to be heavily scrutinized in a biased manner. And even when a developer explicitly says to not be associated with that term, respect their wishes. There's a reason behind it. They want players to experience their games without the hindrance of comparison. Therefore, I play games with that in mind. Well, I play with an open mind. A teammate asked me if I would consider Liza P a Souls-like. My answer, no. For one, I don't use the term Souls-like as much anymore prior to what I said before. Another thing I want to mention, Liza P did a lot different with its story with how it presents itself. The gameplay mechanics are inspired by 3 of the From Software games, Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro, but they added their own flair to it, making it interesting as well as immersive and cohesive with the world they created. They created an experience that makes the player care about their choices in the game through a choice mechanic, which is seen in other story-based games, which helps the character become more human, and the interactions change throughout the game the more human your character becomes, especially through the interaction with the cat in the game. I know I'm always going to mention the cat. Its healing items is even earned in a unique way through the pulse cell recharging through attacking, and that similar guard regain mechanic inspired by Bloodborne also gets your health bar back through getting attacks in through perfect guard. It has unique weapons and does different by swapping blades and handles for fighting arts combinations, and even buffs and blocks. For armor and resistance, it's through different frames that you collect or buy and not the attire. The outfits are just for looks for once, so you can make a snazzy looking character without doing weird combinations for protection. Lies of P may be a dark fantasy, but it's also steampunk. It has a lot of underlying themes of alchemy, anti-religion, and anti-science laced into it, but those are common themes in various games, along with other terms I can't mention here. But I guess I'm trying to clarify a point. Games are pieces of art now. They aren't just for fun anymore. They are pushing new grounds depending on the developer, because greed does play a role these days, whether or not we like it or not. Next time when you play a new game, keep an open mind, remove fan terms, and just play. See what that creator has to offer and experience, and leave it at that.
PlayStation